Let's talk about hinging during pregnancy. Hinging is a really important movement pattern that you want to make sure you master, especially during pregnancy. Part of the amazing part about hinging is that it allows our pelvic floor to move into some ranges of motion that it doesn't normally get into when we are squatting. Another really great thing about hinging is it allows for really great development and strength in our glutes and hips. We want really great, strong glutes and hips during pregnancy to support some of the biomechanical changes that our body is going through. We're going to get into first what is a hinge. A hinge is when we are creating flexion at our hips and the hips are moving more horizontally than they are vertically. So you can think about a hinge being horizontal hip displacement versus vertical hip displacement. That is a squat. So when we are hinging, our hips are going back behind us. When we are squatting, the main direction of the hips is going to be going down. Very simply put, hinge is here, squat is here. I am going to be having you do some staggered stance hinging and some bilateral hinging. Staggered stance hinging is biased a bit more towards single leg, while bilateral hinging means we are using both sides at the same time equally. The reason you're going to learn how to do both is because sometimes one feels better than another during pregnancy, and sometimes one can feel better than another, period. I tend to really like more staggered stance hinging than bilateral hinging, but again, that's just my personal preference, and I want you to learn how to do both of them very well. One of the things that we have got to keep in mind about hinging is that when we are starting out, we want to remember that our rib cage and our pelvis need to stay connected. This can be one of the things that kind of trips people up sometimes because they want to leave their rib cage up and then push their hips back like so. When we do this, we are creating a really open extension pattern, so to speak, here, and we're creating more length on the abdominal musculature than we need to. There's just no need to create more length here, and we really want to be able to keep the rib cage and the pelvis moving together. So for a hinge, one of the things you can think about is taking your thumbs, putting them on the bottom of your ribs, and then you can take your ring finger or your middle finger and just kind of place them right here on your hip bones. And as your hips move back, you should not create more distance between your fingertips. That distance should stay the same. If you feel yourself creating more distance like such, then you'll know it's time to reset, try again. Or if you feel yourself decreasing the distance here, then you'll also know, hey, that's not exactly right. I need to reset and try again. Our first basic of the hinge pattern are the hips moving backwards. We are also making sure, like we just went over, that the rib cage and the pelvis stay in this really nice stacked position as we are going back. The other thing that we want to think about with the hinge are our knees. So when we hinge, we want our knees to go slightly forward of our ankles. We don't want to hinge with our knees right on top of our ankles because that is going to send our center of mass backwards. We want to make sure that we can get the knees slightly forward of the ankle. So you can see here my knees are slightly forward of my ankles. They're not stacked right on top of my ankles. So I do have a pretty decent bend in my knees, but it's not an exaggerated bend in my knees, okay? So we start with our knees slightly forward of our ankles and our knees stay here. As our hips go back, our knees aren't going to straighten. We're not going to do this right here. And then as our hips go back, we really don't need to bend a lot further down in our knees. We want to make sure that we are getting more, again, horizontal hip displacement than we are getting vertical hip displacement. If the hips are continuing to come down, that means that we're continuing to bend our knees a lot more. We want the hips to come back more than they go down. The cues that I really like to give people is that when they look in the mirror at themselves side to, when they're doing a hinge, they should look like a really nice zigzag. I want you to have a straight line from your head to your tailbone. So we don't need the head up like this or down like that. So straight line right here from top of head to tailbone. And then we want to have another zigzag from the tailbone to the knee. Then we should have another zigzag from the knee to the ankle. So we've got this series of really nice straight lines that again should look like straight line here, and then straight line again. So if I were to draw this on a piece of paper, here I'm gonna have this really nice zigzag shape of my body. The reason I call this hinge and not deadlift is because sometimes when you say the word deadlift, people automatically go, no, I can't deadlift, it hurts my back. Well, we're gonna change that narrative. Deadlifting does not hurt your back. Hinging does not hurt your back. We just need to know how to do it well and to develop the proper strength and foundation to be able to do it. If you find that this movement is hurting your back, I really, really want you to take a look at your technique. If you still can't figure out what is going on, book a session with me. We will fix it. This is an important movement pattern to be able to master, not only for your strength training, for your climbing, but also for life. You hinge all the time, and knowing how to do it well is really going to benefit you throughout your lifespan. One of the mistakes I really commonly see in the hinge is as people go back that they let their whole center of mass travel back and then their toes come up off the ground. So we want to remember that when I tell you about knee over ankle or knee forward of ankle, that's so that you can get some weight in that mid-foot. I want you to be able to feel all of your toes on the ground and feel your heels on the ground. You should have pressure going through all of them. And you want to keep that same pressure as your hips hinge back. We don't want to lose the pressure. If you lose the pressure on the front, then that means that your knees have probably gone backwards of your ankles. You're here. And then when you come up, you're going to be using your low back more. So that probably won't feel great. Another thing that I will commonly see is the inability to really let the glutes spread out or let the posterior pelvic floor let go. This will commonly look like someone who really has a curve here and they're trying to hinge like this. So you can see how there's no straight line here. Now I've got a curve and I don't want a curve. I want to be able to let this straighten out, and I want to keep a small amount of lordosis here. Lordosis just means small curve in your low back. That's all it means. I used to think it was a really fancy word, but it's not. It just means small curve. So we want to maintain that small amount of lordosis right here. That means that we are getting some great motion at the pelvis that allows us to open up the glutes and come down. So when you look at yourself in the mirror doing a hinge, things I want you to absolutely check for. Where's your rib cage in relation to your pelvis? When you look at yourself, do you look like this right here? I know that you have a belly. I know that as pregnancy goes along, things look a little bit different. But if you notice that you're already really starting out with your hips way forward of your rib cage, bring them back in. Soften your knees. Are you starting out with your butt already tucked underneath you? Do you have a super flat back right here? If so, what I want you to do is kind of shake your glutes. Untuck your butt. You don't need to have your butt tucked and gripped all the time. From here, I want you to make sure as you're going back that you don't curve down and that you don't over exaggerate up, okay? So we got to let all of this open up back here. Our knees are going to come forward slightly and we're going to keep all of our zigzags really nice, tight, straight lines. One thing to keep in mind about your hinge is as your pregnancy progresses and your bump grows, your range of motion will decrease. This is normal. It just means that you may have to raise the ground up to you slightly. So a great way to do this is using a yoga block. So as you can see, I've got my kettlebell up here on a yoga block. That means that I'm not going to have to hinge quite as far down and I don't have to compensate at all. So if I had a really big pregnant belly and I was trying to hinge over, let's say I was doing a bilateral hinge, so I'm doing both legs at the same time, Another reason I like to use more stagger stance is it allows for more room for your belly. But if I had a bilateral stance here, I'm hinging down and I'm going to hinge. Once I get to about, let's say right here, then my belly's in the way and I can't really reach the kettlebell. So my only other choice from there is to kind of round down, or I'd have to extend more through my low back. And we can see that neither one of those positions is what we are after. So we want to make sure that when we have a belly that is getting in our way and creating compensations in our form, that we just switch some things up. You're still going to be using the same amount of weight. You're still doing the same movement. You're just going to be able to do it with better form despite having a little bit of a belly. Okay, so I would be here, kettlebells raised up. Now I can keep my really nice straight lines, come up from here. I'm going to come back down and voila. I didn't have to change anything due to my pregnant belly. Last thing I'll leave you with about hinging is, where do you feel this working? You should feel this working in your posterior chain. Your posterior chain are your hamstrings, your glutes, your back, and you should feel this some in your core as well. You may even feel this some in your lats, but since you're a climber, you're likely not going to feel this in your lats too much. Your lats are already really strong. So what we don't want to feel is this really overworking our low back. I am telling you that this exercise works your back. It is okay to feel it working, but if you are experiencing pain, especially sharp pain in your low back, that is not the goal. That is not what you want to be feeling in this exercise. You don't want to only be feeling your low back or having it make your low back really cranky for days on end. It is okay for your back to feel worked. Just like your hamstrings get sore, sometimes your back can get sore. That doesn't mean that you've done anything wrong, but we want to look out for that acute pain or that really, really high discomfort level. That is not the goal here. Overall, I would love it if you really didn't feel your back at all. Every time I do any sort of hinging, it lights my hamstrings and my glutes on fire. And I feel my back, but there's no discomfort there. I just know that it's working. More of what's uncomfortable is how hard my hamstring and my glutes are working. So I really know that I'm getting that posterior chain on board really well. All right, that is your foundation for hinging, and I will see you in the next video.